Now to kick off some of the more formal proceedings, I'd like to invite Dan to deliver the keynote speech. Dan's going to speak on the importance of growing an impact investment and social enterprise ecosystem to create the world we want to live in and to share stories from his many years in the space. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Tom. Tom and I are good friends, so he's allowed to tease me. I have a theory, which is when I travel without my wife, I am somewhere between 8 and 12 times more likely to die. And there is reason behind it. So there is a thesis that I have that supports this, and there's a couple of data points, and one of these data points relates directly to Perth, and that's why every time I come to Perth, I'm reminded about this theory. So has anyone ever run a risk matrix where you have, the two axes? You have the likelihood of a risk and then the impact of that risk, yes? Everyone's familiar with that? I'm really good at making decisions based on the likelihood or responding to the likelihood of a risk, and my wife is incredibly good at responding to the impact that a potential risk could have. And a few years ago, we were in Perth, and I won't name the hotel. I can't remember the name of the hotel, but we were staying at a hotel, and it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. We were both fast asleep, and all of a sudden, the term gripped by fear, I actually felt a hand of fear gripping me. And I truly mean that I could feel fear in a hand gripping me. I woke up suddenly and I looked at the end of our bed in the hotel, and there was a man standing at the end of our bed. It was pretty dark, so I couldn't kind of make out exactly who this person was, but there was a man standing at the end of our bed. And my wife kind of let out, it wasn't really a scream. I don't think she had that much in her at that point in time, but it was like a shock sound, and this guy runs out of the room. She starts freaking out. I look at her and I say, it can't be that bad because he's gone. And I went back to sleep. My wife, whose name is Lawrence, spent the rest of the next sort of 5 hours thinking. I thought likelihood. I thought, well, if he really wanted to hurt us, he hasn't hurt us and he's run. So, probably low likelihood he's coming back. She was thinking impact, and spent the next 6 hours kind of, in frightened terror that someone might walk back through the door. This has nothing to do with what I'm about to talk about, by the way. I genuinely, as I was flying into Perth today, thought I remembered this. And anyway, it turns out, so just to close the loop on the story, so it turns out that a guest was checking out very early in the morning, had left his sunglasses on the table, had given the concierge the wrong room number. The concierge had come up into our room, had stood at the end of my bed. He was as shocked as we were that there was someone in the bed and had bolted out. But hence, whilst I feel I'm pretty good at judging the likelihood of risks, hence my wife, in retrospect, probably was the smarter of the two of us. At least, it proved that I was right. But notwithstanding that, if I had been wrong, the impact of that would have been catastrophic. And that reminds me every time that I fly into Perth about my likelihood of death while I'm here. So I'm meant to talk to you about all of the things that Tom said I'm meant to talk to you about. I'm very bad at sticking to a brief, so I'm probably not going to stick to that brief. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of that ecosystem and impact investing, a little bit of the what, but I don't really want to spend a lot of time in the what. I think there's a conversation that we often miss when we're talking about social entrepreneurship, impact investing, all the things. And that conversation is why? Why would you bother to engage with this at all? I think we miss that often, and we start with the what is it, and does that really matter if you haven't decided to engage with this? So just in terms of just to briefly touch on the what, impact investing and and I'm just going to use the first bit's going to be a little bit investor-centric. I'm sorry about that. I will weave in a bunch of examples which will bring it to life from many other perspectives. But if you're going to engage with investing or using our resources, and typically that's capital, so our investment capital, to invest in things that have more than just a financial return, you probably need to think about a couple of things. You probably need to be quite clear about a couple of things. The first of which is, what is impact to you? What do you care about? Because if you're not clear about that, what you consider to be an impact investment, or what you consider to be solving a particular social issue, is different to what the person next to you thinks is impact investment or solving. What matters to you does not necessarily matter to the person next to you. I have sat with entrepreneurs who are incredibly passionate about the problem that they are solving, and the person next to them doesn't even think that the problem they're solving is a problem. So it can be quite a personal decision, but being clear about that, and particularly as an investor, being clear about what impact you are actually trying to have is really important. The second thing is just being really clear about the types of assets that you would like to invest in. Very investor-centric, I know. But tonight we're going to talk a lot, and I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about venture capital. Most investors in Australia do not invest in venture capital directly. Like, they don't do it. So when they decide to become an impact investor or decide to invest with impact, I'm not sure that it necessarily makes sense that they all of a sudden become a venture capital investor. So if venture capital is not for you, then, find the space that is for you. In impact investing is a very broad church. Maybe for you're much more comfortable investing in the share market. Well, actually, there's now two funds. One which is actually a retail fund which focuses on impact and reports on impact, that 8IP, for any of you that know the fund manager, has issued. Maybe you're a property investor. Well, there's opportunities to invest in housing for people with disabilities through the Summer Foundation and their work. There's a number of emerging opportunities in affordable housing. We do green office buildings. So there's lots of different opportunities depending on if you're a property investor. If you want to get at the pointier end of this, and social impact bonds are a thing that you want to explore, that's something that you can do. That's very different again. And, there's a limited number of them available in Australia. But the early signs have been relatively positive. And likewise, there's opportunities in renewable energy and microfinance and all sorts of different stuff that you could invest in should you choose to do so. It is not, just because venture capital or social enterprise is not for you doesn't mean the whole space is not for you. The last point I'll make on the what is being clear about risk and return, as any investor should be, is also really, really critical. And not just risk around financials. I think people have this, they've got sort of 70 years of modern portfolio theory to figure that one out, but also risk around impact. What is the risk that my investment is not going to achieve the impact that I want to have? And what's the risk of negative consequences as well? And yes, there is a whole spectrum, all the way from doing zero interest loans all the way to venture capital impact funds that are seeking to get the same returns as any venture capital fund, but have impact in the process. So, you can find your spot along that spectrum. That's all I'm going to talk about on the what. I really just wanted to share with you a couple of thoughts on why you would engage with this at all. And the answer to that really depends on who you are, because depending on who you are, there are very different reasons why you would engage with this space at all. So if you could bear with me for a couple of minutes, I'm assuming there's many different groups here, and I'm just going to share some observations that I've collected over the last few years from both here and overseas around different groups and why they are engaging with this as a topic at all. I might start with government. I don't know how many people there are here from government, but if you're government, there's lots of interest in this space. I would say if a lot of governments, particularly, and probably led by the UK, particularly around social enterprise. But I think government have tended to be engaging with this space because, firstly, it is an opportunity at times to spend taxpayer money more effectively and potentially avoid costs. Okay, so a good example of that can be the use of either payment by outcomes contracts or social impact bonds. Hands up if you're familiar with social impact bonds. Okay, hands up if you could explain them to my mum. Okay. Would anyone like me to explain a social impact bond in the way that I explained it to my mum? Okay. So NewPin, which was the first social impact bond. Imagine for a second you're New South Wales government and I'm Uniting Care Burnside and I've got this great program called the NewPin program. It's getting fantastic results, returning children in out-of-home care back to their natural families by working intensively with those families to create a safe family environment for that child to return to. Everyone got it? Yes? Okay. And that's determined by the New South Wales courts, not by me, okay? So I think this is a great program. I come to you, New South Wales government, I say we're getting like twice the rate of return. We know how good this is for the kids and for those people, through the rest of their life. How about you give me another $10 million to run my program? And in government, you say, we don't have an extra $10 million to give you, but we love you, but no $10 million. And so you say, okay, I know that it costs you $60,000 a year, every year, for every kid that is in foster care, okay? So what about, rather than you giving me the $10 million, you just share part of that $60,000 with me that you save every time I return a child out of foster care to their natural family. And that's like a no-brainer for you because you're like, well, I'm only paying you money that I'm saving. So you say, okay, how about I give you $40,000 for every child that gets returned? And I say, fantastic, let's do that. And we shake hands, and that is a payment by outcomes contract. And many governments around the world are trying to move away from paying for programs towards commissioning for outcomes, paying for when the actual outcome is achieved. Sounds good. It's obviously more complex than I've just explained, but that's the general concept, right? The problem for me is I used to get $10 million from you to run my program. Now I only get paid like in year 1 or 2 years' time when I deliver the outcomes. So what do I do now? Where do I get the money to run my program? That's where, now some organisations are big enough and they can just run the program and they'll stop at a payment by outcomes contract. Others will choose to raise money from investors through a social impact bond, which will allow them the working capital to be able to run that program. And then when they get the outcomes, assuming they do get the outcomes, government will pay them for the success fee and they will pay that to investors. Yeah. So for government, it's kind of a good deal if structured well, to spend more effectively and potentially save costs. The other thing for government is unlocking innovative new ways of particularly there's many entrepreneurs in this room. You have the opportunity to solve a problem which has maybe classically been seen as a problem for government to solve or at least fund a solution to. So I was talking to a couple of entrepreneurs the other day who have started a business called Exceptional, and the entrepreneur has a sister who is on the autism spectrum. She had 20 years of really difficult time holding down a job. He ended up starting this company, which is a software testing company, and he recruits people that are on the autism spectrum because for them, they make incredible software testers, okay? So all of a sudden, he's turned something which was a disadvantage for his sister and others into something which is actually a competitive advantage for his business, so much so that he's now also running a recruitment business from that business for corporates who want to hire people on the spectrum as well for those types of activities. Okay. Now, there are all sorts of employment benefits in there, mental health benefits, all sorts of things that typically government would have funded. And there is quite an innovative approach to how that problem is being solved. And he actually has no interest in he's not government funded. He has no interest in government funding. But it's actually, a problem that typically government would solve, and it'd be nice for someone else to be part of solving that as well. if anyone from a foundation or anyone from the philanthropic world, hands up if you're from a foundation or a philanthropic world. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time here unless you're hiding and don't want to identify yourselves. You'd be rushed for grant applications after that at the end. So, look, foundations have actually in the US been a really early mover in this space. My observation is there's sort of three things driving that or that have driven that. One is more effective use of their grant money. And so there are times where instead of giving money away where you have the 100% certainty of a 100% capital loss, that you may be able to get the same outcome but have a chance of getting your money back, either through a loan or through equity or whatever the case might be. So I sit on a medical research foundation called San Filippo Children's Foundation. It's a very, very rare genetic disorder. It's a small foundation. We'd raised $1 million. We worked very, very, very hard to do that. We had found the most promising research in the world in the US, it happened to be in the US, and we wanted to grant that $1 million to that research with the view to getting them to do an Australian trial out of Adelaide. And we were only going to release money like in milestone payments for them to actually do the trial here. We were about to write the first check of our grant, and we had this board meeting and we said, this is a for-profit, private company that does this research. Could we at least try to do something other than give them the money? Could we do a loan? Could we get some equity for the money that we're giving them? The answer might be no. And our mission is our mission, and we are mission obsessed. If the answer is no, then we'll give them the money as a grant, if that's the best tool to use. But the answer might be something other than no. We spoke to them and they said, yeah, we're open to giving you some equity for the money you give us. So we didn't think we were ever going to see much on that equity, but we cut the first $250,000 check, and 1 month later they got taken over by a NASDAQ-listed biotech company. And 2 weeks ago, we sold 3/4 of the holding that we have for $2.5 million. And the CEO and founder of our little medical research foundation is pretty bloody happy. We have a trial up and running in Adelaide, of which one of her children is actually is fortunately in. She has 2 children, and both of them have this rare genetic disorder. And we get to reinvest all that money in the mission. So it's a much more effective way of us trying to think of how we use that very precious philanthropic capital. The other one for foundations is just bringing some ethics or morality to their investment portfolio. We did a solar fund recently, and we talked to many of our investors were foundations that have an environmental mission, because it kind of makes sense that they're not owning emitters of carbon, that they might be investing in things that are having the opposite effect. That's a bit of a no-brainer, really. If you have a social mission as a foundation, to put all your resources, ideally, towards that mission, and at least not working against that mission, makes a lot of sense. To finish off quickly, if you're a corporate engaging with this space, I can give you 2 things that are compelling. I've been told not to use the word compelling. I don't know why, but that are compelling. And one of them is, if you haven't figured it out yet, engaging with this space is an absolute must if you think you want to be in the market for the best young talent in Australia, and if you want to retain that talent. If you are not giving young people today a sense of purpose and a sense of where your business and your organisation fits into the world and the positive contribution that your organisation can make to the world, you will not retain those young people. You won't. And even more so if you are in the finance world and you have customers and clients, particularly if you have investors, and you can't see the 2 biggest changes ever about to happen, which is all of that wealth that's been accumulated by the Western world since World War II and that wealth over the next 20 years is all going to transfer to a group of millennials who think very, very, very differently about the world and how that wealth should be used to many generations before them. You're missing a big theme. And the other sub-theme of that, which most people actually missed, is for the very first time in history in the West, 50% of that money will go to women, which has never happened before, right? Okay, so sons typically inherited the wealth, the eldest sons and then later sons. This is the first generation where 50% of the wealth in the Western world will be inherited by women. And women think very differently about how that money should be used also. So those are two huge themes that if you're missing now, I hope you're in the last few years of your career, because it's going to bite you in about 10 or 20 years if you're not. So I'm going to finish up there. If you want to engage with this space, how do you do that? So the first thing I would say is find your spot, right? And what I mean by that is it's a broad church. It's very big and it can feel really messy. It's kind of like if you've decided to move, if any of you are from another state and you decided to move to Perth, you don't buy the whole city of Perth, right? You figure out what's the neighbourhood I like, what's the street I like, what's the house that feels right, okay? And it's kind of the same with this whole space. You don't have to like buy into the whole thing. You can find the spot that is that's interesting to you. I like working with early stage entrepreneurs, right? Early stage ventures, because I love working with entrepreneurs who are passionate and have a terrible business model and need that to be an awesome business model. And if I can add something to that process, that's really exciting. And last year, I spent an entire year working with two co-founders at a business called enterprise called Ability Mate. They do 3D printing of orthotics for kids with cerebral palsy. So rather than getting a casted plastic handcrafted orthoses, they 3D print them. And, you know, that to get to that took like 3 years. They started out doing all sorts of crazy, stupid stuff. But they just had so much potential as entrepreneurs. And I get a kick out of that. So find your spot that you enjoy. Secondly, I would say support the ecosystem. If you think this thing is just going to magically rise out of the ground, it ain't. You need to be investing and working with building that ecosystem, from the intermediaries, the advisors, the incubators, all of the groups that help support the enterprises. And that's smart because every bit of IP they build is reinvested in that ecosystem, right? When you put it into an enterprise, it's often used once, like teaching an entrepreneur how to raise capital once, and then it's a long time before they use that skill set again, versus teaching an intermediary how to bring an entrepreneur through that process is something that can be replicated over and over again. So it's a good return on investment. And lastly, I'm going to finish off with this point. I have no idea how I've gone for time, but my last point, do something. Just do something. Like, this space it's so easy to look for all the holes in everything. And it's so easy to kind of just let inertia stop you from doing something. And the best thing that you can do is just do something. Don't make perfect, right, the benchmark. It's kind of like making Romeo and Juliet your benchmark for relationships. You will die alone, right? And you don't want to die alone. If you want to be in this space, don't wait for perfect. Find something that looks good, that you can live with, and do something. So that's it. I'll leave it there.